Welcome to today's session, which is an introduction to resistance training. The purpose of today's session is to talk about why it is important to do resistance training, look at common terminology and common concepts behind resistance training. So resistance training, also known as strength training, is an increase in the muscle's ability to do work. So our goal in resistance training is to increase the load or the work that the muscles can do so that the muscles will adapt to be able to lift a greater load or do more work. When we talk about muscle mass, we're talking about muscles being able to adapt to increase their strength or to increase their mass. Now, one common myth that is believed in today's society is that people can get too big from doing weights. Now, women in particular believe that they'll get too big from doing weights. However, one of the major hormones required to increase muscle mass is testosterone. And women do not produce enough testosterone naturally to get a massive increase in muscle mass. Therefore, it's very, very rare for a woman to put on massive amounts of muscle mass or to become extremely muscular naturally. The other myth is people will often talk about muscle turning to fat. Muscle is muscle and fat is fat. The more muscle you have, the more fat you will burn. The less muscle you have, the slower your metabolism is, and the more likely you are to put on more fat. So it is important that we understand that muscle is different to fat and that muscle cannot convert to fat. Muscle will burn fat, but it will not become fat. When we look at endurance, resistance training is important to increase our endurance. When we train our muscles in a strength training program, these muscles get stronger and they're able to adapt to function more effectively, which in turn leads to them being able to work for a longer period of time. Resistance training also helps our metabolism. You see, physical activity increases our metabolism. By increasing our muscle mass and our muscular activity in the body, this leads to a higher metabolism in the person, which means they burn more energy and in turn will burn more fat. Resistance training will also increase your energy levels. It does this by increasing your metabolism. So then that way a person has more energy, they feel like they have more energy and they're able to function for longer and more effectively. Resistance training will also increase your stability. So what happens is when we train correctly, we not only train our muscles, our tendons and our ligaments, but we also train our neural system. So resistance training will make all of these structures stronger, but most importantly what it will do is it will increase the nerves, the tendons and the ligaments and the smaller muscle around the joints, creating a greater amount of stability in the joint so that the joint is actually more stable and stronger during functioning. Resistance training will also increase your bone mineral density. Now, bone is a metabolic tissue and every 7 years we lay down new bone in our body. So by doing strength training and resistance training, we are actually applying a load to our bone, which means the bone responds to that load by becoming stronger. It also becomes stronger at the connective points where the tendons and the ligaments attach to the bone. So then what happens is the attachment sites become stronger, so you are less likely to injure the tendons and ligaments at the bone's attachment site. Now, resistance training will also strengthen connective tissue. As I've mentioned before, strength training doesn't just work our muscles. It also works our connective tissue, our tendons, our ligaments, our cartilage, our joint capsules, and the fascia that connects all these together. So by doing resistance training, all of these structures get stronger, which means you get an overall increase in strength in the body because it's not just the muscles that are stronger in the bones, but it's also your tendons and your ligaments and the connective tissue as well. Now, resistance training will also help you increase your ability to increase your range of movement. Now, range of movement is your ability to move through a full range of the joint. So being able to squat all the way down to the floor and come all the way up. Now, from a practical sense, this is really important for people as they get older who then get weaker muscles and they struggle being able to sit down or get up and down off the floor. By getting these people to do resistance training, you not only increase their strength and you increase their range of movement, but you also increase the strength of the muscles in those elongated phases where they're at their weakest phase, which then prevents the person from falling. It prevents instability in the muscles and weaknesses when the person is, say, sitting down or trying to get up off the floor when the muscles are fully elongated. Resistance training will also improve your posture. By getting a person to train correctly and strengthening their back muscles and strengthening their core, you'll improve the person's posture, which will in turn prevent back pain, neck stiffness, headaches, and all those other problems that come with bad posture. Resistance training will also increase the strength of the joints, the tendons and the ligaments and the bones, which will reduce your risk of getting injured. So when you are playing sport and you do end up having a load applied to your body which could lead to injury, because you are stronger and the tendons and the ligaments are stronger, you are less likely for that injury to occur. Now, one of the most important things to understand when you're talking about resistance training is the fact that resistance training burns fat. You see, by doing resistance training and increasing our metabolism, we increase our fat burning capacity. So it's like if you have a 4-cylinder car, it will burn a certain amount of fuel. If you turn that into an 8-cylinder car, that will burn more fuel. Now, in the body, our metabolism is the number of cylinders we have in the engine, and the fuel is our fat. So we want to turn ourselves into that V8 or that V12 so we become a fat burning machine. So by doing resistance training, we actually start to burn more fat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, not just when we're exercising. So anyone who wants to lose weight or tone up, which is really just losing weight so you can see the muscles, needs to be doing resistance training. Resistance training also prevents numerous lifestyle type diseases. Diseases such as diabetes, type 2 diabetes, heart attacks, stroke, and osteoporosis have all been shown to be related to a sedentary lifestyle where the person doesn't do exercise and doesn't increase the stress on their body. They're not doing strength training. So by getting someone to participate in a regular resistance training program, you do actually decrease the likelihood of these lifestyle diseases from occurring. There is also evidence out there showing that people who participate in regular exercise programs and regular resistance training programs also decrease the risk of having Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and even cancer. So let's have a look now at the common terminology that we use when we talk about resistance training. To start off with, resistance training is lifting a load a certain number of times to increase the strength or the mass of the muscle. This load can be applied in any way, whether it be dumbbells, barbells, body weight, kettlebells, pin-loaded weights, or even bands. It doesn't matter as long as we're increasing the load and getting the muscles to lift a load. The second term we're going to look at is what we call progressive overload. Now, progressive overload is actually increasing the mass or the load applied to the muscles. So there are many different ways to increase the load or to apply a progressive overload. One way to have progressive overload is to increase the number of times the person is lifting the weight, which is the number of reps. You can also have progressive overload by increasing the number of sets that a person's doing. You can increase progressive overload by increasing the weight, which is probably the most common variable used to increase progressive overload. You can also increase progressive overload by applying stability factors to the weight where the person is more unstable and they have to stabilize the joint while lifting the weight. So there are many different ways to actually change the load and get progressive overload when training in the body that we're going to teach you. Our next common term we talk about, you'll hear people talk about, are repetitions. This is the number of times that you lift the weight through the eccentric and the concentric phase. So when you're looking at a push-up, when you start in the push-up, you lower yourself down, you push yourself up. That is 1 repetition. If you were to do 10 reps of that, that would be 10 reps. Now, this is then used when we're talking about sets. So if you were to do 1 set of 15 repetitions, that means you've done 15 push-ups where you've gone down and up, down and up, down and up 15 times without a break, and then you have a break. That would be 1 set of 15. So a set is a specific number of repetitions that you would do in an exercise, where your repetition is an exercise where you go through the eccentric and the concentric phase. Repetition maximum is a term that we use when we're talking about. Repetition maximum is a term that we use when we're talking about a person training to complete failure. So what this means is the person lifts the weight as much as they can until they can't lift it anymore. Now you can have 5 RM, which is 5 repetition maximum. You can have 10 RM, which is 10. You can have 50 RM, depending on how heavy the load is. So if someone lifts a weight 5 times and on the 5th repetition they get it up, but they cannot lift the 6th time, so they actually fail and the weight has to be lifted off them, that is known as a 5 RM set. If a person is doing a 10 RM set, that means they can lift the weight 10 times, but they cannot possibly generate that 11th contraction. Alright, now there are 2 types of exercises that we do in the gym. We have compound exercises and we have isolation exercises. A compound exercise is an exercise that utilizes more than 1 joint. So for example here, a push-up uses your shoulder and your elbow. These 2 joints are moving in the exercise. When we look at a step-up, it uses the hip and the knee. So again, these 2 joints are used in the exercise. Dips, shoulder and elbow. Lunges, hip and knee. When we look at an isolation exercise, what happens is we only use 1 joint. So we're isolating 1 joint out in the movement. The dumbbell fly uses the shoulder. Leg extension uses the knee. The bicep curl uses the elbow. So only 1 joint is moving. We also talk about hypertrophy and atrophy. Now hypertrophy is an increase in the volume of a tissue, organ or organ. Specifically in the gym industry, we talk about hypertrophy in relation to the muscles. Now this is due to an enlargement of the cells. This is not due to more cells being laid down, it's just the cells getting bigger. And this can happen in skeletal muscle or it can happen in even heart muscle. Now atrophy is partial or complete wasting away of the body. So this will tend to occur when a person doesn't do strength training or they don't use a body part. What will happen is the muscle basically shrinks due to the wastage of the cells and it gets smaller. Now this will tend to happen with this sort of person. What happens is they stop doing weight training, okay, and as they stop doing weight training, their muscles shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink. Now one of the common things that happen with someone who looks like this who stops weight training is they could potentially keep eating as if they are weight training, and of course what happens is instead of when they shrink they're turning to this, they actually put on more body fat because they haven't changed their eating and they're requiring less energy, and hence they become an overweight person. This has led to the myth that muscle turns to fat, which it doesn't. Muscle will burn energy and burn fat but will not turn to fat. Muscles either grow through hypertrophy or they actually shrink or waste away through atrophy. Now we talked a little bit about repetition maximum, and repetition maximum is when you cannot generate another contraction than lifting a weight. What happens when you hit repetition maximum is you get what we call momentary muscular failure. This is when a muscle is not able to produce another contraction under that current load. You can certainly make it lighter and it may be able to produce a contraction, but under that current load it cannot produce another contraction. This happens in RM training. Okay, but you'll notice here it says that it's momentary muscular failure. So if you were to work your legs until you hit momentary muscular failure on squats, basically you'd collapse on the floor and not be able to lift another weight. But give it 20 seconds or 30 seconds, and what happens is the creatine phosphate replaces the ADP to form the ATP, and then hence you can now get another contraction and potentially do another set. And that's why people will do 2 or 3 sets to complete failure. So it's not that the legs don't work anymore and they won't work for a prolonged period of time. It's completely momentary. But once the energy systems rebuild, it can work. This is an extremely high intensity way of working the muscles, and if you want to get results, this is the best way to get them. So we talk about a theory of use it or lose it, and this is true. When you don't use muscles, you lose strength, you get weaknesses in the tendons and ligaments. What happens then is, because you have a loss of strength in the muscles and you have the atrophy of the muscles, you then carry more stress in the joints. See, when we have muscle covering a joint like this, what happens is the muscle takes the load out of the joint and actually carries the load in the muscles. When we get atrophy occurring and we lose this muscle, we carry more load in the joints. Then the joint actually becomes stiffer because it's not getting used as much, and we get a decreased range of movement because as this muscle gets weaker, its weakest position is in the either fully extended or the fully contracted position, so hence the actual strength in the range of movement decreases. Then what will tend to happen is the person's range of movement will decrease as well. When their range of movement decreases, that means they stop using the joint as much as normal, hence the viscosity or the runniness of the fluid inside the joint, of the synovial fluid, will actually thicken and it will turn into like a syrup instead of water, and hence you then end up with joint stiffness and joint pain. So the great thing about all of this is it's completely reversible. You can get someone training and reverse all of these effects and get the person training properly again, and it will reverse, the muscle will strengthen, the viscosity of the joints will increase. As the muscles, the tendons and the ligaments get stronger, the range of movement increases, hence the joint pain goes away. This is something we commonly see in older people. They have an inability to sit down because they haven't used their muscles have got weaker, their joints get stiffer, and by getting them on a strength training program, you can reverse all this and really give them back their quality of life. Okay, what we want to talk about next is our training variables. These are things that we can change in our training to actually increase progressive overload or to change it up for a person. The first variable we're going to look at is your intensity. There are 3 levels of intensity. We have our submaximal intensity, our maximal intensity, and our supermaximal intensity. Submaximal training is what most people do. This is where they train at a submaximal level. So they're not training to failure, and they do sets and reps. So this is where a person will do, say, 5 sets of 15 or 3 sets of 12, and they're able to complete their sets without having the muscle fail. This is just known as submaximal training. You can still work really hard submaximally, but you're not actually failing. Now, maximal training is a term used for RM training, or repetition maximum. This is when a person trains to that momentary muscular failure. So again, that 10 RM means they can only lift it 10 times, and it's impossible to lift it the 11th time. So maximal training is when they achieve momentary muscular failure, not mental failure. Okay, so the person physically cannot generate another contraction. Supermaximal training is where you actually implement different techniques to train beyond momentary muscular failure. So you remember that momentary muscular failure is not being able to create another contraction of that exercise with that specific load. What you can do is you can utilize drop sets or giant sets, force reps, negatives, isometric holds, supersets, or pre-fatigue to actually bring these to actually get the person to go beyond failure. So in a drop set, what we do is the person may be doing a dumbbell press and they start with 50 kilos, then we drop that dumbbell down to 45, then to 35, then to 25, and then to 15. And because the load's getting lighter, the person is able to produce more work through their muscles. This is super maximal training. The important thing here is to do a proper super maximal drop set is every single set within the drop set should get to failure. A giant set is where you can go, it could be pyramiding up or down, and we do more than 3 drops. Forced reps. What happens in a forced rep is the person's trying to generate that one more lift and you can't make them do it, so you help them lift it. So that you get them through those sticking points to force out those 3 or 4 extra reps. You can also do force negatives. You'll see this occur a lot, for example, on a push-up where someone pushes the person down. So the person's going out slowly and you push them down and the person has to try and resist that. This can also happen in chin-ups where you pull the person down. So forced reps is you force the person to do a couple more reps where they wouldn't be able to do it without you. Negatives, you're only doing the eccentric phase of the contraction. Negatives are a great way of teaching clients how to do push-ups or chin-ups. You just get them starting by going down. But the whole idea of a super maximal negative is the weight is so heavy that the person actually can't lift it concentrically and they're only doing the eccentric phase. So for example, here's you putting someone on a bench press with maybe 100, 150 kilos and they just have to slowly control it down. Then people lift it up for them. They control it, slowly control it down. Then you get it lifted up for them and lowering down nice and slow. This is your negatives. Isometric holds are where you don't actually change the length of the muscle. So you're holding it perfectly still. You're not going up, you're not going down, you're holding it still. Supersets are where you put 2 exercises together. So you may superset dips and then push-ups. You may superset bench press with push-ups or chin-ups with a lat pull-down. Now there are 2 different types of supersets. You could do supersets where you use the same muscle groups, or you can do supersets where you use different muscle groups. So you may superset squats with push-ups or dips with chin-ups, or keep it in the same muscle group as I explained before. The final super maximal training technique we're going to talk about is pre-fatiguing, and this is where you do an isolated exercise like a dumbbell press or a prone fly to isolate a muscle before you do the compound exercise. You tend to use this exercise when you're trying to isolate out the bigger muscles like the chest before you do a compound chest exercise, so then that way the limiting smaller muscles such as the arms don't actually become the limiting factor. The chest becomes the limiting factor. You need to remember you're only as strong as your weakest link. So in a bench press, your chest is probably most likely your strongest muscle, then your shoulders and your triceps. So it will be your shoulders and your triceps that stop you from doing more weight. So by doing a pre-fatiguing of the chest, your chest is now fatigued when you do the bench press or the push-up, and hence it limits you from doing any more. Now this type of training is very specific. It's really for growth and it will shock the body and should only really be used when you're looking at advanced participants and advanced programming. Our second training variable we're going to look at is weight. So increasing the weight is another way of increasing the intensity. This is probably the most common used variable you see in the gym. Our third variable is the speed or the tempo that we lift the weight. So every lift has 3 phases. It has an eccentric, a hold, and then a concentric. And what we talk about when we're talking about tempo is the speed that you go down, how long you hold it for, and then the speed you go up. So you may have a 1-1-1. Down for 1, hold for 1, up for 1. Or you may have a 1-0-1, down and straight up. Changing the speed of the actual tempo of the exercise, or the speed of the rep of the exercise, changes the intensity. By going a lot slower, the person's muscles are under that force for a lot longer period of time, and hence the muscle has to generate a lot more force to lift it. By going faster, you're actually creating more acceleration in the muscles and you're getting more explosive contraction through the muscle. So have a play around with this when next time you're training, and do some slow reps, do some fast reps, and feel the difference of the intensity of each. Our next training variable we're going to talk about is actually looking at a person's stability. You can actually increase the intensity of training by creating less stability in the exercise. So when I'm talking about creating less stability, I'm talking about taking the person, say, from a pin-loaded weight to dumbbells or a barbell or even to body weight. You could go from, say, doing a bilateral exercise like a seated row to a single arm row, which is a unilateral exercise. You could also bring in stability tools like getting the person to stand on a BOSU or getting them to do push-ups on a fitball. By removing stability from an exercise, what happens is the tendons, the ligaments and the joints and the smaller stabilizing muscles in the joints have to work harder to stabilize the joint for you then to be able to develop that contraction. So this is a really good variable to play with your clients if you don't want to increase the weight or the load. Our last variable we're going to talk about today is rest and recovery. Now, when we're looking at rest and recovery, we're talking about a couple of things. We could firstly be talking about the amount of rest you give the person in between sets during their workout in the gym. You might decide you're going to give the person a 90-second rest in between each set or a 3-minute rest. Now, this will be dependent on why you're training them. Are you training them for fatigue? Are you focusing on trying to prevent, say, the lactic acid or the creatine phosphate system from recovering? Or do you want them to be fully recovered? Now, when we talk in Cert 4 about training specific athletes and looking at periodization, we'll talk more about this, but the big thing to look at here when you're actually training a person is you need to think, what is their reason for training? And if they're training for an event that doesn't have a lot of recovery, then you need to do that same sort of scenario in their training program. The second variable we're going to look at here in rest and recovery is how much time do you give the person in between workouts. So you may not want them to fully recover in between workouts because you may be preparing them for a competition where they need to compete every day. Or alternatively, you actually may want to give them 24 to 48 hours in between workouts so that they're not sore and they can fully recover in between workouts. Again, it depends on the person's goals and the person's needs. When we're looking at helping a person recover, there are two types of recovery a person can do. There's active recovery and passive recovery. Active recovery is always much, much more quicker and it actually can prevent injury. The best types of active recovery is getting the person doing something, getting them moving, going for a walk, going for a jog, or doing a light session. However, they can also bring in other therapies such as massage or heat therapy, or getting them to do hot-cold baths. These are all different techniques that we can use to help improve recovery. Now, one of the concepts you need to understand when you're programming people is looking at how the body recovers. So this is what we call the recovery time curve. And this is where a person sits on their baseline and they train right here. After they train, we damage their muscles. Their muscles become weaker and their muscles' ability to do work drops. What happens is the body then compensates for this and says, we need to improve. So what happens is the brain sends messages to the muscle or to the system that's working and says, you need to get stronger, you need to get fitter, you need to compensate for what we've just done so we can handle that load next time. And that's what happens here in this part of the curve known as supercompensation. The body has compensated for that training session and, as you can see, has improved by either getting stronger or getting fitter. When we're training people, the ideal time we want someone to train that same muscle group again is in this area of the supercompensation phase. What happens is if they train too early is you could end up training them down here and then you'll end up with this same curve down here and they'll go backwards. And then you'll end up with symptoms, overtraining symptoms, where the person will get tired, they'll get irritable, they'll get really sore, they won't tend to recover from their workouts, they'll get grumpy, and eventually they'll get injured. However, in the other end of the spectrum, if you leave it too long, so for example, some people who do a 5-day split will have 5 to 7 days in between their workout, what can happen is this supercompensation will drop back to a baseline if you don't train again. So the person's compensated, they've got stronger or they've got fitter, but then it's dropped off because they haven't actually trained here to actually improve that. So let's have a look at recovery in a little bit more detail. As we've talked about through numerous lectures now, when we're doing resistance training and we're exercising, we're not just dealing with the muscles, we're dealing with all the other systems in the body as well. You're dealing with the endocrine system, you're dealing with the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, you're dealing with connective tissue, energy systems, and obviously also the muscular system. So when we've given a person a workout, we need to give them time to recover from all of these systems. So let's first have a look at our neuromuscular fatigue. It's important to understand that the nervous system does fatigue and it will limit our performance. Nerve impulses either turn on or turn off the muscles. And when we're training hard at a high intensity, the nervous system will also need to recover. When fatigued, the actual nerve cells are affected and you can actually lose the ability to stimulate muscles, or you can actually end up with a situation where the muscles are continually being excitated and they're being overstimulated. Overtraining in the neural cells will lead to the cells protecting themselves and entering into an inhibited state. You often see this with injuries, and you often see this with clients who have postural problems where nerves are entrapped or there has been an injury and the body has gone into a protective state, turning off certain muscles. The second system we're going to have a quick look at is our muscular system. Obviously, when we train our muscles. And when we do resistance training and we use progressive overload, one of the things we actually do is we actually injure our muscles. We cause damage to the muscles in neuromuscular tears. So we actually tear the muscle fibers, and then these fibers have to repair to be able to allow the fibers to grow and get bigger and stronger. Now, the muscle soreness that we get is termed delayed onset muscle soreness. This is known as DOMS. When you look at the theory of DOMS, what will tend to happen is DOMS are caused by two main reasons. The first one is mechanical damage, and the second one is chemical damage. So mechanical damage is where we do a heavy load and the actual muscle fibers actually tear. Where chemical damage is where you get a buildup of acid and waste products in the muscle, and this then damages the muscles, causing damage to the muscle fibers. Now, both of these two situations lead to an injury response in the muscle, and hence the muscle will then actually get sore because it goes through an inflammatory stage and it swells. Now, the inflammatory response will take 24 to 48 hours to kick in and help the muscle repair. The better your nutrition, the more active you are, the faster the recovery will be. So how much soreness is healthy and how much soreness is unhealthy? You see, when we're looking at muscle soreness, we're really looking at small little injuries in the muscles that have to heal. The difference between muscle soreness and muscle injury is the amount of time that soreness lasts. Usually soreness that lasts 3 or 4 days is a sign of muscle soreness and muscles recovering. But muscle soreness that lasts longer than that and potentially could last a week is certainly getting to the stage where you may be starting to have a risk of injuring the muscles rather than the muscles actually just having micro tears and then repairing themselves. Now, muscle soreness can kick in usually 24 to 48 hours post-training. This is really interesting because sometimes you can work a client really hard and they won't get sore at all, and then sometimes you could just ask someone to do 10 squats and they're so sore that they can't walk for a week. So you can never tell how sore someone's going to be, and you can never actually tell when they're going to be sore. As a trainer, I always found that my clients were the most sore 48 hours after the session. Yet I had another trainer who worked alongside me and all of his clients were sore usually 24 hours after the session. The interesting thing is when I trained his clients, their soreness patterns matched what I normally saw. And when he trained my clients, they were sorer earlier rather than at the 48-hour mark. So this is something that's really hard to understand and hard to explain. You can never determine when someone will be sore or won't be sore. The important thing when dealing with beginners is your goal is to actually motivate the person to exercise and to move. So you don't want to make them so sore that they can't move. You actually want the client walking away from the gym feeling like they could do more and that they want to do more, and then that way it motivates them to come back. The chemical damage we were talking about before can often be caused due to lactic acid accumulation. Now, a lot of weight training sessions tend to utilize either your creatine phosphate or your lactic acid system. When you have a think about most weight sessions, an exercise will tend to last between 30 to 60 seconds, and hence this then sits right in the creatine phosphate to lactic acid energy systems. So therefore you will often get an accumulation of lactic acid in the muscles when we're training them. This can fatigue the muscles and inhibit the muscles from working. It prevents the nervous system from being able to actually get the muscle to contract properly. And because lactic acid is an acid, it will actually damage tissue, and this damage is known to be caused through a process called acidosis, where the acid basically eats away at the tissue. Now this is a normal function that occurs in the body, and it is a way of getting muscles to get bigger and stronger. But it will still create soreness, and it will still lead to the person needing to recover. Acidosis also prevents muscle contractions by inhibiting the cross-bridge binding. So when you remember how we get our sliding filament theory and our cross bridges going across from our thick fibers to our thin fibers, lactic acid prevents this from occurring. And this sort of thing can happen in very high intensity workouts. So you want to make sure that if you are doing a session that's dealing with the lactic acid energy system, that potentially you need to actually expect that the person may have soreness due to lactic acid buildup. So you want to get them out moving the next day, because when you get them out walking or moving the next day, what will happen is the blood will gush through the muscles like a hose, cleaning out the muscles, helping remove the lactic acid, helping remove the waste products, and that will help get rid of the soreness a lot quicker. Now, one of the signs that we need to be very careful of, and that you need to know for your assessment, is signs and symptoms of overtraining. A lot of people will overtrain, and that we need to be looking out for these symptoms. Firstly, if you're training someone really, really hard and they're not adapting to their training, then that potentially could be a sign that they're overtraining. So if you're doing too much, what happens is the body will shut down to protect itself, and you won't see any results at all. The second sign of overtraining is they tend to have a prolonged recovery process. What this means is their recovery, which should take 2 to 3 days, is taking 5 to 7 days. When this occurs, you really want to think about maybe giving your client a week off. Another sign of overtraining is when the person seems to be fatigued, or they're actually going backwards. So their muscles are weaker week in and week out. So rather than feeling stronger and lifting more weights, the clients are feeling weaker and much more tired. Of course, this is a classical symptom of overtraining, and this is typically where you need to try and get your clients to take a break. You'll also find clients are unable to sleep, they're unsettled, and they're irritable, or they even may lose their appetite. Now, most clients' overtraining occurs when a trainer is only training them a couple of times a week and they start doing secret sessions. They're sneaking into the gym when no one's around and trying to pump out that extra session, or they're training at home in between sessions 2 or 3 times. You'll also see overtraining occur with people who are trying to do AM and PM splits, or people who are training too often, or their split is not giving their stabilizing muscles enough recovery. So you need to make sure that when you're programming the person, you're not only looking at the muscles they're using and the joints they're moving and the stabilizing muscles, you also need to be thinking about the energy systems they're using and how you can start to challenge different energy systems to allow a change up in their training so that the person's aerobic system can recover and while you train their anaerobic system, and so on and so forth. Okay, what I'd like to do now is take you through a really important topic, and this is one that you will need to know for your assessment, and a concept that you will need to understand when writing programs for people. People go through 5 stages of adaptation. The first stage of adaptation when someone starts a resistance training program is their coordination phase. Now, their coordination phase is when the person actually learns the ability to do the exercise. Anytime a person starts a resistance training program, or they come back to doing a resistance training program after a long break of 3 to 4 years, you may need to focus on giving them light weights with high reps to help them learn the movement patterns. Everybody has what we call dominant learned behaviors. And when someone does a squat, or they do a lunge, or they do a push-up, what they'll tend to do is they'll do that exercise using the movement pattern that's the most dominant to their behavior. When training people to actually do exercises, if they've learnt the wrong technique and their dominant learned behavior is incorrect, what you'll actually need to do is retrain them to do it correctly, so that when later on you're moving into a strength phase or a power phase, that their new dominant learned behavior is the right technique. Now, the second phase of adaptation is called neural adaptation. Neural adaptation is where the nerves and the muscles learn to work together in generating a movement. So when we look at doing a bench press, we're not just using our chest muscles, we're also using our shoulder muscles, our arm muscles, and the stabilizing muscles in the shoulder as well. And what has to happen is the body needs to develop a pathway where all of these muscles and these nerves work together to help generate the movement. So during the neural adaptation phase, what you actually do is you lay down neural pathways for each of the exercise. So eventually what will happen is you'll have a neural pathway for a bench press, a squat, a leg press, a chin-up. And these neural pathways are what allow the muscles to actually work together as a team to help not only stabilize the joint, but to also allow maximal power to be able to lift the weights. The third phase is our strength phase. Now, this is the phase where you get physiological changes at the cellular level of the muscles. Hence, muscle cells start to get stronger, they start to get bigger. Now, in the first 2 stages, the person will feel that they're getting stronger, and they will be able to lift heavier weights. The reason this occurs is because they actually get better coordination, and they generate a better ability for the muscles to work together, which in turn leads to the person being able to lift more weight. But from a cellular perspective of the muscle, you do not see changes in the muscle's physiology until they enter into the strength phase. And this is when you'll start to see growth. Now, the amount of time it takes to move someone through these stages of adaptation is dependent on the type of training that you're doing with the person and the exercise history the person has. Typically, we look at between 4 to 6 weeks of coordination, 4 to 6 weeks of neural coordination or neural adaptation before they will enter into the strength phase when dealing with a gym program. However, when doing personal training and doing more complex exercises that challenge the nervous system and challenge the stability of the body at a greater level than a machine would, these stages can occur a lot quicker, and hence you can get the person to this stage in 2 to 3 weeks. This is the stage we want to get the person to, because this is where we will start seeing changes in their metabolism, their body being able to start to burn fat and change shape. Now, the next stage in adaptation is where we actually start to generate speed. So a lot of the time, this is where we will take the average everyday person. We will take them into a strength adaptation phase, and we just leave them there, continuing to use the progressive overload so they get stronger and stronger, they burn more fat, and they have a really great quality of life. However, when we're dealing with elite athletes and we want to take the person to that next level, What our next adaptation phase is speed. So speed is the ability to actually create a movement as fast as you can. So these are like, this is changing your tempo to be as fast as possible. One of the things that you need to do before you do speed training is ensure that the person has fantastic technique and really good stabilization and stability through the joints that you're using. Otherwise, what's going to happen is the person will lose control of the weight and they will jolt their joints, leading to injury. So when we take someone into a speed phase, what we tend to do is drop the weight and technically go back to body weight. So if I was taking someone through a speed phase so that they could actually do explosive squats, I would take them back to doing jump squats and going up as fast as they can and going down as fast as they can. Before then, I would move them into the next phase, which is power. Now, because we've already dealt with strength and the person's getting these strength changes in the body, when we move them into a speed phase, as they start to get the coordination, they start to fire their fast twitch muscle fibers and they start to get everything working together, they will start to get benefits of strength in this speed. And when we start to add weight, what we've now done is moved the person into a power phase, which is strength and speed. And the sorts of power training that we look at and the sorts of exercises we give people for power training are your Olympic lifts, such as your cleans, your clean and jerks, your snatches, your push presses, and all those sorts of things. The step that you would take people through when you start doing power training with them is really plyometrics training, where you would get them using body weight as for their explosive movement, more so than using weights in the gym. Now, when you start dealing with speed and power, you really need to make sure that you have sport-specific reasons for doing this. And so that way we can move the person into the movements that they're required for their sport. Because these are high-risk exercises and you can injure your clients. So please make sure that you do have a reason to take people beyond this stage of adaptation. So quickly reviewing our 5 stages of adaptation is stage 1 is coordination, stage 2 is neural adaptation, stage 3 is strength, stage 4 is speed, and stage 5 is power. Okay, so that's our basic introduction to resistance training. There's been a lot of information in there, a lot of reasons why we do strength training or resistance training, and common terms that we use. The big concepts we really want you to be focused on is understanding each of these, obviously, but we really would like you to be able to understand the variables of training, be able to define supermaximal, maximal, and submaximal training. You need to understand tempo and speed, stability. You should be able to explain the difference between an active and a passive recovery. You should be able to draw and label this curve. And you should be able to, on this curve, tell me where the ideal place is for someone to train. I'd also like you to be able to explain what DOMs are, the 2 reasons why we get DOMs. And I would also like you to be able to tell me what these signs and symptoms are of overtraining, as well as naming the 5 stages of adaptation and how they progress in what order. Of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us via email and we'll be more than happy to help you along the way. Thanks a lot.